In this video, we're going to kick off our series of videos on mesh baking in InstaMAT by walking through how to bake mesh maps from a high poly or source mesh to a low poly target mesh to transfer details and create all the necessary maps needed to take advantage of InstaMAT's procedural masks, materials, and effects. Let's dive in. All right, so here we are in Instamat Studio, and now there are multiple ways to use the bakers in Instamat. And in this video, we're going to be baking mesh maps for asset texturing project. So I'm going to create a new project here, and I'm just going to highlight over the asset texturing project type. Now, asset texturing projects let you easily apply procedural materials, paint on your meshes, and use powerful effects to create awesome 3D assets. And if you'd like to learn more about asset texturing in Instamat, be sure to check out our videos on our YouTube channel. Now, before we dive in and we start creating our asset texturing project and begin baking meshes, I just quickly want to overview the high to low poly workflow if it's something that you're not very familiar with. The high to low poly workflow typically involves two meshes. A source mesh, which contains all the intricate details of the model, is usually modeled out with a subdivision surface or sculpting workflow. This is called the high poly model because it often contains a higher amount of polygons to represent those intricate details. The target mesh is often a simplified version of that same model, usually broken down into simpler shapes. This low poly model is often constructed with the high to low baking process in mind so that it accurately captures the intricate details of the source model but represents those details using texture maps instead of modeled out geometry. In this example, we can see that I have this sci-fi crate and I have two versions of the asset. The high poly source mesh with all those intricate details and the low poly target mesh with simplified parts and pieces. The target mesh also has its UVs unwrapped. To learn more about UV unwrapping in Instamat, check out our videos on our YouTube channel. Now let's go ahead and get started baking. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about the high to low poly workflow, let's go ahead and create that asset texturing project. So just to remind you, I went ahead and gone to create a new project, and now I choose asset texturing. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in a mesh, and this mesh is going to be the target mesh. It's what we're going to be baking all of our high poly details onto. And so I've just gone off screen here and I've grabbed my low poly target mesh. I'm just going to drag and drop it into this mesh slot here. You can see we have this low poly lion. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this lion statue. And one thing I want to check here is to bake mesh upon creation. And this is going to bring up the baking panel. And this is going to bring up the mesh bake panel once our project has finished being created. So I'll go ahead and enable that and choose to create a project without a template. All right, so here we are, and we can see we now have the mesh baking panel here. And I'm going to close it. I'll show you how to bring it back in a second, but I just want to show you what kind of model it is we're working with. So this is a low poly version of this lion statue. This could be from scan data, that we created a low poly version from, or this could be a sculpt as well. And by the way, this low poly was created using Instalot. And if you're curious about how to create low poly, retopologized versions of your assets with Instalot, go ahead and check out some videos that we have on our YouTube channel here on using the remesher. It's a very powerful workflow. So now how do I go ahead and bring up that mesh bake panel again? Well, there's two ways I can do this here. Quickly, I can go ahead and go up to this oven. This is the mesh baking panel button here, and that's going to bring it back. I can also go to the layering project editor panel here, which is next to the package manager and the library panel. And I can go over to material sections and I can choose to bake mesh data here as well. And that's going to bring up the mesh baking panel. So let's go around these different settings here just to get a brief overview of the mesh baking panel. Right now in this top main section, you can see that we have our target mesh. Again, that's the mesh that we're going to be baking onto. Then we have the source mesh, which is going to contain all of our details, all of the high frequency information that we want to apply to our target mesh. And by the way, the target mesh, of course, has our UVs already laid out. That's also something we can do where we can unwrap UVs inside of Instamat. And I'll go ahead and link a video in the description below on how you can unwrap UVs with Instamat as well. So let's go ahead and fill this out a little bit. Let's go ahead and bring in the source mesh with all the details. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag and drop this in here. By the way, you can also click this little kind of folder icon. And if you have, some meshes in your the package that you're currently working in, you can use this here, or you can choose to pick a local file and use the Explorer window, the Finder window to go ahead and find your resources on your computer. So we've got our source mesh and our target mesh, and now we can choose things like the baking engine and the baking resolution. So with the baking engine, I can choose to use the GPU or the CPU. Both are very powerful baking engines, and you can select the one that works best with your system. Then we can choose the resolution here. And so I'm going to go ahead and choose a resolution of 2K. And so that means that when we bake the mesh maps out, they're going to be at a 2K resolution. And what I recommend that you do here is that you bake the mesh maps at the resolution that you're going to be working in InstaMAT, or what the resolution is going to be when you export the texturing of this asset out into the next part of your pipeline. So if you're creating a game and you want the asset with all of its texturing to be at 2K resolution in its final version, then go ahead and bake out those mesh maps at 2K. Or, if you're doing a 1K asset, bake it at 1K, but just make sure that you keep these things consistent. Below the baking resolution, we can see that we have super sampling. And so this is pretty cool. What this does is it multiplies our chosen resolution here by a factor. So in this case, we have by 2. So what this is actually going to do is it's going to bake the 2K map actually at 4K. And then it's going to sample it down to 2K so that we have all of this extra information that we get from a 4K bake, but it's been sampled down into a 2K map. And it's a great way to get additional, nicer details from the bakes that we're getting, but not with the larger file size of something like a 4K map. And so I usually leave this at times two. You can certainly go above that and do, times four, times eight, but I rarely ever do that. I think times two is a good option, and then baking at 2K is a great starting point. But you can also disable super sampling if that's something you'd like to do as well. Now, when we bake our mesh maps, we can choose a file name format. So we can use, determine the name. You can see we have these variables here, like, what the material is, what year is it, what's the width and the height of the map itself. And you can come up with these naming format conventions that work best for you and your pipeline. And then you can also choose the baked mesh map file format, file extension here. So in this case, the default of PNG is great. And we can see what our file format is going to look like, the convention that we're using here, and everything's looking great here. So that's how you can kind of customize the baked mesh maps, the files themselves that are being created when we go through the baking process with InstaMAT. Now, next up, I'm going to briefly talk about the advanced settings and the cage mesh settings here. We're going to go into these settings in a bit more detail in some later videos in our baking series. But just so you know, here under advanced settings, we have things like the targeting mode. And so this allows us to do things like baking by mesh name. We're going to talk about this in a later video, but it basically allows you to bake related low and high poly submeshes, with each other exclusively, so that you don't have any baking artifacts or things projecting onto other surfaces that they don't belong. And so this is a useful way of baking without having to explode the mesh. So if I'm using terms that you're not familiar with baking, that's totally fine. We're going to cover this kind of stuff later on in the series. So in this case, I'm just going to set this to all source meshes in this case, but this is where you find it if that's something you're looking for. We also have the outwards ray length and the inwards ray length. Again, something you don't need to worry about too much. We'll talk about it maybe in a future video, but this is where you can dial in those specific settings here as well as ignoring back faces, averaging the normals, a little bit more of these kind of advanced settings like dilation in pixels. So this is useful if you want to solidify, add some solidification to improve the results of your baking. And if you're getting artifacts from mip mapping and mip map bleeding, again, you can increase this here. A lot of technical terms here. Like I said, these are the advanced settings. Most of the time, you're not going to have to worry about these very much. Then below here, we have the cage mesh settings. And so what we could do is you could input a cage mesh here if you need it. And you could, in that FBX file that you import, you can give the cage mesh a suffix so it knows which mesh to use. Oftentimes, I find I really don't need to use cage meshes with InstaMAT, but if it's part of the workflow that you're accustomed to, you can go ahead and bring in a cage mesh here. So now let's talk about the right side of the panel here. And so we have the active bakers and the inactive bakers. And you can see I have a lot of these bakers enabled by default. Things like the ambient occlusion, the curvature, mesh ID, the normal maps, and position and thickness. And these are all really valuable maps to have to give InstaMAT a lot of knowledge and information about the asset, the mesh that it's texturing, like where it is in the world, where are the curvature, the sharp edges or crevices that kind of dig in, things like that, can all be discovered and used with InstaMAT's powerful functions, features, and utilities to be able to procedurally texture our 3D assets. And we can enable and disable these things here too. So for example, you can see in my inactive bakers, I have something like, let's go and find the bevel normals one. So if I enable this, you can see it now appears in my active baker section here. And I actually have some additional settings for curvature and bevel normals. Those two things are kind of related, but I can go ahead and adjust those here too. And the bevel normals map is pretty neat. It allows you to take a low poly asset and kind of bevel the edges, but put that beveling into the normal map instead. It doesn't have to create new geometry, but it can kind of fake that nice, smooth corners around hard edges that you get with low poly objects and bake that into the normal map instead, which is pretty cool. We're not going to need that in this case, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove it. You can see it's back in my inactive baker. So go ahead and have a look at all the different settings that you have here for like ambient occlusion, curvature, mesh ID maps, stuff like that. And you can go ahead and see how you can tweak those settings here in the right side of the panel. By the way, if you dial in your baking settings and you want to use them again, what you can do is go to the File menu here for the Mesh Baking panel and save your settings out, and then go ahead and load them back in again if you want. So again, before we just bake things off, you can see here's what my original mesh looked like. It's pretty low poly. If I go ahead and enable the wireframe, you can see that here. Not too much detail, just kind of a simplistic form of the lion sculpture that we have here. And so now let's go ahead and bake our mesh maps just by going here and hitting the bake button. All right, so we can see that the bake is finished. You can actually see in the layering project editor panel that our baked mesh maps are being automatically hooked up here in the materials section of our project. I'll just go ahead and hit OK, and I can go ahead and close this panel. And now you can see that we have our really nice, high frequency details baked onto the surface of our statue here. It's a great way to be able to get this nice extra detail on our model without having to have all the additional geometry and everything, sculpted or modeled out into the topology. So this is looking absolutely fantastic. There's a few things I want to cover though before we continue on. One of those things is how do we view our baked mesh maps either in a 2D view or on the surface of the 3D mesh in 3D space like this. There's a few ways that we can do that. One thing I want to do though is you notice here in our channels that we have baked an ambient occlusion map. We don't have an ambient occlusion channel. So let's go ahead and add a channel, and I'll just choose ambient occlusion. And this is going to allow us to now see our ambient occlusion information in our scene and also be able to manipulate and work with it with different layering types. But now let's go ahead and take a look at how we can view our baked mesh maps in InstaMAT. So I'm going to go over to the library panel here. This is the Mat library panel, and I'm going to type in the word bake. And here we're going to find the Mesh Select Bake Data node. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and drag that node into the layer stack here. And it's going to look a little bit funny, but what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to change the projection mode with the little projector here from triplanar to UV. And so now we can start to see our baked mesh maps in 3D space on our mesh. And so what I want to do now is, I'll go ahead and press the C key. And what that does is it brings us into, if I go into my viewport settings, go into the solo material mode, and we're looking at the base color. And so that's what this mesh select bake data node does. It puts the texture map here and sets it to the base color map. And when we go into this solo mode, we're not getting any of the lighting in our world here applied. We're just seeing strictly the baked mesh map on our 3D mesh here, which is really nice. And so now what I can do is I can also view this in a 2D view as well. So I'm going to right click the layer here, and I'm going to choose to view the output for the current channel. And that's going to open up the 2D view, the image viewer here, which I can also toggle on and off with the buttons up here in the toolbar. And so now I can start to see my baked mesh maps, on here as well. So I can go and change this from a tangent space normal map to a position map. And again, we can see the same thing here in 3D and in 2D at the same time. Let's go over and look at something like the curvature map. We also have the thickness, and let's see, we've got that ambient occlusion map again as well. You can see all the contact shadows there and stuff like that, which is really helpful for texturing, adding things like moss or dirt that goes into the crevices, things like that. And we can view these both in 2D and 3D at the same time. So before we wrap up this video, there's just one thing I want to do here. I'm going to go ahead and press M on my keyboard for material mode or PBR mode. I can go ahead and remove this layer. And I just want to show you how easy it is to texture this asset using some of the powerful features inside of InstaMAT. So I'm just going to go over here to my library, and I've been working on a layer material, a smart prefab layer material, where it allows me to texture anything here to make it look like an old statue with moss growing on it. So I've gone ahead and saved that layer material that I'm working on. I'm just going to go ahead and drag it into my layer stack. You can see that all of my layers and my masks and things like that are here. And now I can, view my asset all textured and ready to go. And so this is just a small part of the really powerful procedural nature of InstaMat that you can tap into. And you can see that we're using these baked mesh maps in a way where, there's dirt in the crevices of, the lion's mane and things like that. You can actually see we're using the position map to take all this dirt and kind of apply it more to the bottom of the statue. And then, up here we have the moss, and it's mainly concentrated where, sun and light would shine on the lion and things like that. So it's really, really cool. And I'll go ahead and just enable ray tracing here so we can get a nice final look of that. But this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of our mesh baking series. You've seen how we can now take a high poly and a low poly model, and we can bake all the high poly details and transfer it onto the surface of that low poly asset that we have here, and then be able to view those mesh maps in InstaMat, and then also utilize them just quickly using things like smart prefab layer materials and other types of effects in InstaMat Studio. So thanks a bunch for watching this video on getting started with baking mesh maps for asset texturing projects. Be sure to stay tuned for the next videos in our series covering different baking techniques and workflows in InstaMat. And you can find the links to those videos as they get published in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. For the latest news about InstaMat, please visit our website, follow us on X, join us on Discord, or sign up for the Abstract community. You can find all the links in the video description below. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.